My name is Maren Cole. I'm 33 years old. Last Thanksgiving, in a dining room that smelled like orange oil and pecan pie, my mother-in-law stood up with a glass of wine in her hand, looked down the table at me, and told 14 people that I had married her son for money. She didn't whisper it. She didn't dress it up. She said it the way you'd announce the weather. Let's all be honest for once, she said. Adam married a girl who was very good at recognizing a family with something to lose. Some women marry for love. Some women marry for an address. And then she laughed like it was a joke, so that anyone who objected would look humorless. I sat there with my hands in my lap. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw anything. I looked at the woman standing at the head of that beautiful table, in that beautiful house on Elmsworth Court, and I thought about the fact that she had no idea, none at all, that the house she was standing in had belonged to me for 4 years. Welcome back to Isle of Regret, where silence becomes the ultimate revenge. If you've ever had to sit still and smile while somebody rewrote who you were in front of a room full of people, drop a comment and hit subscribe. I think this one is going to feel familiar. Let me take you back, because the insult wasn't the beginning. The insult was just the day the truth finally ran out of room. I grew up in Gaffney, South Carolina, in a rented duplex on Ridge Street with a screen door that never latched right. My mother, June Cole, cleaned houses for a living. Not for a company, for herself. She had a route. Tuesdays and Thursdays she drove 80 minutes north into Charlotte, because Charlotte money paid nearly double what Gaffney money paid, and my mother did the math on everything. She kept her supplies in a milk crate in the trunk of a 1998 Buick Century that was the color of weak coffee, orange oil polish, vinegar in an old juice bottle, a stack of cloth rags cut from my father's shirts after he left. He left when I was 7. He is not really part of this story, which was, I think, always his intention. Here is the thing about my mother that shaped everything I became. She had a phrase. She used it so often that when I was young I thought it was a proverb everybody's mother said. Never argue with somebody who's enjoying it. She said it when a cashier shorted her change and made a scene about being questioned. She said it when a neighbor accused her of moving a trash can. She said it to me at 11, when a girl named Shelby told the whole bus my clothes smelled like bleach. My mother did not tell me to fight back. She told me to write it down. Write it down. Write it down. Put it somewhere. Then go be excellent. I thought that was the weakest advice I had ever heard. I understand now that it was strategy dressed up as patience. When I was 12, my mother added a new house to her Thursday route, 41 Elmsworth Court in Charlotte. A big brick colonial with black shutters and a brass kick plate on the front door that she polished every single week because the woman of the house liked to see her reflection in it. That woman's name was Vivian Rhodes. I remember the house because I sat outside it. School let out at 2:15 and my mother's Thursday clients ran late. So from March to June of that year I did my homework in the passenger seat of the Buick, parked on the curb under a water oak, with the windows down and a warm can of ginger ale sweating in the cup holder. I could see the front door from there. I could see the brass plate catch the light. I never once went inside. Mrs. Rhodes had a rule about children. And then in June my mother came out of that house early, 40 minutes early, walking fast, carrying the milk crate against her hip like it was heavier than usual. She got in the car. She put both hands on the wheel and she didn't start the engine. I asked her what happened. She said, she thinks I took her brooch. It was a garnet brooch. Small oval dark red stones in an old gold setting, the kind of thing you'd inherit rather than buy. Vivian Rhodes kept it in a lacquer box on her dresser, and had noticed that morning it wasn't there. And the only person in the house who wasn't family was the woman on her knees cleaning the baseboards of the upstairs hall. My mother offered to empty her pockets. Vivian told her that wouldn't be necessary, in the tone people use when they mean it absolutely is necessary but they'd like credit for being gracious. She paid my mother for the day. She said she thought it would be better if June didn't come back. That was it. No police, no accusation on paper. Just a soft, well-mannered erasure. My mother drove us home. Somewhere around the state line, she said, without any heat in her voice at all. Never argue with somebody who's enjoying it. I said, she wasn't enjoying it. My mother said, baby, she was relieved. That's worse. I didn't understand that for about 15 years. Here's what I need you to understand because it matters later. My mother lost 4 other clients that summer. Charlotte's east side is smaller than it looks. Nobody said the word theft. Nobody had to. Word simply moved the way water moves, and by August my mother's Thursday route was empty, and she was picking up shifts at a laundry on Highway 11. We didn't lose the house because we didn't own one. We lost the margin. We lost the extra. I stopped taking the school trip to Washington. My mother stopped going to the dentist for 4 years, which is a decision that costs you more later, and she knew it and did it anyway. I wrote it down. I actually did. I had a marbled composition notebook, and on a page near the back I wrote, in 12-year-old handwriting, 41 Elmsworth Court, Vivian Rhodes, brooch. And then I did what my mother told me to do next. I went and got excellent. I want to be careful here because this is the part where a lot of people's stories turn into a fairy tale, and mine wasn't one. I didn't invent anything. I didn't win anything. I got a job. I graduated from Gaffney High in 2011 with a 3.9 and no plan because plans cost money. I did 2 years at Spartanburg Community College taking business classes at night and working the front counter at a tire shop during the day. Then at 20, I answered a listing for a receptionist at a small firm in Charlotte called Halloran Title and Abstract. $11 an hour. I took it because it paid $1 more than the tire shop and because Charlotte was the direction my mother used to drive. Halloran was 4 people in a filing room. The owner was a woman named Ruth Halloran, who was 61, wore reading glasses on a chain, and had opinions about everything, most of them correct. Title work, if you've never encountered it, is the business of proving who actually owns a piece of property and what's attached to it. Liens, easements, judgments, old mortgages nobody ever released. It is unbelievably boring, and it is the closest thing this country has to a public record of every private disaster. I was supposed to answer the phone. Within 4 months I was pulling deeds because I was faster in the county system than the 2 examiners were. Within a year Ruth had me doing full searches. Within 3 years I was a licensed title examiner, and Ruth was calling me at 7 in the morning to ask what I made of a chain of title in Cabarrus County. Ruth taught me the sentence that became my whole career. She said it over a file, tapping the page with a chewed pen. Marin, people lie constantly. Paper doesn't. I have thought about that sentence almost every day since. By 26 I was making $68,000 a year, which to a girl from Ridge Street felt like a rumor. I lived in a 1-bedroom in the Belmont neighborhood with a radiator that clanged, and I saved 40% of my income, which sounds impressive and was mostly just fear. I moved my mother out of the duplex and into a rental with a yard. And in the course of the work I saw the same thing over and over. I saw houses fall out of families. Not dramatically, quietly. A second mortgage taken to cover a business. A tax bill missed during a hospital stay. A private loan from a hard money lender at 14% that made sense for 6 months and then didn't. I watched 100 families lose the one asset they had because nobody in the family was willing to look at the paper. At 29 I formed a company. It cost $125 with the North Carolina Secretary of State, and it took 11 minutes. I named it JC, Hollow Properties LLC, Fitty for June Cole. Hollow because there was a place off Ridge Street called Tanner's Hollow where my mother used to take me to look for creek stones when there was no money for anything else. It's the only sentimental thing I have ever done with a legal document. The business was small and unglamorous. I bought distressed notes and undervalued single-family properties, mostly in the $50,000 to $200,000 range, in neighborhoods lenders had stopped caring about. I did my own title work, which is the entire edge. I could see the problems that scared other buyers off and know which ones were real. My first purchase was a duplex on Kingsley Avenue for $51,000 with a busted sewer line I fixed for $4,000. By the time I was 31 I owned 9 properties outright, and had a line of credit I'd never fully drawn on. I still drove a 9-year-old Honda. I still cut my own hair for 2 years to save the $60. My mother, who had by then moved to a small house in Gaffney I'd bought her for $92,000 in cash, told everyone at her garden center job that her daughter worked with real estate, which was accurate, and told them nothing. I did not talk about money. I want to be very clear about that because of what comes later. I didn't talk about it with friends. I didn't talk about it on dates. Growing up the way I grew up, money is not a topic, it's a wound with a scab on it, and you don't pick at it in public. That habit, the not talking, is going to look like a mistake for most of this story. It wasn't. I met Adam Rhodes on a Tuesday in October 2019, at a hardware store on Central Avenue, in the plumbing aisle, because he was holding 2 different wax rings and looked genuinely distressed. He asked me which one he needed. I asked him what he was doing. He said he was fixing a toilet at his school because the district maintenance request had been open since August and 46th graders had one working bathroom. I asked which school. He said Braxton Middle. I said I'd gone to a school like that, and I picked the right wax ring out of his hand and put the other one back on the shelf. He was 30 when we met, tall, a little stooped from years of standing over a music stand, with a coffee stain on his sleeve he hadn't noticed. He taught orchestra. He had 81 students and 44 instruments, and he spent his own money on rosin. I liked him immediately, and I did not trust it because I don't. Our third date was at a diner on Monroe Road. That was the night he told me about his family, and I want to walk you through what he said because it's the foundation of everything. He said his father, Warren Rhodes, ran a company called Rhodes Millwork, custom cabinetry, moldings, staircases, started by Adam's grandfather in 1957. At its best in the 80s, it had 30 employees and a contract with half the builders in Mecklenburg County. Adam grew up in a house where the dining room table had been made by hand by his grandfather, and everyone was reminded of it constantly. He said his mother was named Vivian. He said it in a particular way. A slight flattening. The way you say a word you've had to say carefully your whole life. I asked what she was like. He thought about it for a long time. Long enough that the waitress refilled our coffee, and he said, "She's very concerned with how things look." Then he said the sentence that I would eventually understand was the entire architecture of that family. "We don't discuss money at our table. That's the actual rule." She says it out loud. I remember laughing because to me it sounded quaint. A house so comfortable it can afford not to discuss money. It took me 2 more years to understand it was the opposite. That rule wasn't a luxury. It was a load-bearing wall. As long as nobody discussed money, nobody would notice there wasn't any. He told me one more thing that night, and then we talked about other things for 4 hours. He said, "My mother still lives in the house I grew up in. She'll die in that house. It's the only thing she's ever been proud of." I asked where it was. He said, "Off Providence. A street called Elmsworth Court." I want to tell you that I felt something dramatic. That the diner tilted. It didn't. What actually happened was that I put my coffee cup down very carefully, and I heard my mother's voice in my head saying never argue with somebody who's enjoying it, and I said, "That's a pretty part of town." And then I went home and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time in the dark. I could have ended it right there. I've been asked that since by exactly one person, and I'll get to her. And the honest answer is that ending it never crossed my mind. Adam Rhodes fixed toilets at a middle school with his own money. Whatever his mother had done to my mother when I was 12 had nothing to do with the man holding 2 wax rings. But I'll admit something less noble. I wanted to see the inside of that house. Not to do anything. I want to be precise because later a lot of people would try to write me a motive I didn't have. I didn't want revenge. I was 26 years old. I'd spent my adolescence looking at a brass kick plate from a car window, and there was a 12-year-old somewhere inside me who wanted to know what the upstairs hall looked like. That's all it was. Curiosity with a scar on it. I met Vivian Rhodes on the second Sunday in December 2019. Adam parked on the street. She didn't like cars in the drive. And we walked up under that same water oak, which was bigger now, and I looked at the brass kick plate on the door and it was still polished. Somebody was still polishing it. She opened the door herself. Vivian was 62 then. Small, upright, silver hair, set every Friday at the same salon on Providence Road for 31 years. She wore a cream cardigan and a strand of pearls to a Sunday lunch with her son. Her handshake was a hand touch. She put her fingers in my palm and withdrew them, the way you'd hand someone a receipt. She said, "Marin, what an unusual name." I said, "It was my grandmother's." She said, "How lovely to have something of hers." If you have ever had a mother-in-law, you already know that sentence had 4 floors and I was standing in the basement. The house was smaller inside than the 12-year-old in my head had built it. Beautiful though. Heart pine floors. A staircase with a hand-turned newel post that Adam touched as he passed it without noticing he was doing it. Blue and white ginger jars on the mantel. The dining table, the grandfather's table, long, dark, oiled, with a bowl of pears in the center that I would later learn were replaced weekly whether or not anyone ate them. And the smell. Orange oil. That specific sweet sharp furniture polish. The exact same brand my mother kept in a milk crate in the trunk of a Buick. I stood in that front hall for a second and I had to put my hand flat against my thigh. Adam's sister Corinne was there with her husband Dale and their 2 boys. Corinne was 34, a pharmaceutical rep. quick and loud and warm in a way that always seemed to be measuring the room's temperature before committing. She hugged me. She said, "Oh, thank God, a normal one." And Vivian said, "Corinne," in a voice like a door closing. Lunch was chicken and rice and green beans cooked with bacon. Vivian asked me questions in a specific order that I have since learned is a standardized test. "Where are you from?" "Gaffney." A slight pause. "Gaffney." Like she was tasting something. "And your parents?" "My mother lives there still. My father isn't in the picture." "I'm sorry to hear that. And what does your mother do?" "She works at a garden center." Longer pause. "How wholesome." "And you?" "I work in real estate." And this is the part one need you to hear exactly, because everything that happened over the next 6 years grew out of this one exchange. She said, "Oh, you sell houses." And I said, "Something like that." That's it. That's the entire lie if you want to call it that. 2 words. Something like that. I didn't say I was a licensed title examiner. I didn't say I own 9 properties. I didn't say the word LLC. I sat at a table where the standing rule was that money is not discussed, and I followed the rule. She smiled at me with genuine relief and said, "Well, everyone has to start somewhere." And she never asked me another question about my work again. Not once. Not in 6 years. I've thought about that a lot. People assume a secret is something you build. Most of the time it's just something somebody declines to ask about over and over for years because the answer they already invented is more comfortable. Then over dessert, the first crack. We were having pound cake. Corinne's youngest knocked over a glass of milk and Vivian was up with a cloth before it reached the table's edge, blotting, saying, "Not on the wood, not on the wood." And then she said, half to herself, half to the room, "I cannot get help in this house anymore." Not honest help. Dale laughed. Corinne rolled her eyes. Adam didn't react at all. And Vivian, wiping the table, said, "The last one I had walked off with my mother's brooch. Garnet. 1920 setting. Right off the dresser." I sat very still. She said, "That was years ago. But you learn." Nobody at that table thought anything of it. It was a piece of household folklore, worn smooth from handling. The story of the woman who stole from Vivian Rhodes. It had probably been told 200 times at that table. It had probably been told to every guest who ever spilled anything. And I sat in the chair with my fork in my hand and I understood something that changed the shape of my life. My mother didn't just lose a client and 4 other clients and a summer's income and a dentist. She had become an anecdote. A permanent character in a stranger's dinner conversation. For 14 years in this house, June Cole had been the thief, told and retold to people who had never met her and never would. I did not say a word. I want to be honest with you about why, because I took the high road would be a lie. It wasn't Grace. I was 26 years old, 4 months into loving a man, sitting at his mother's table, and I had no proof of anything. My mother had no proof. There had never been a police report, never a charge, never a document. There was one woman's word and one woman's silence, and I already knew from 3 years of pulling records for a living, exactly what that adds up to. It adds up to nothing. So I did what I was taught. I went home and I wrote it down. I still have the note. It's on my phone in a Plain Notes app dated December 8, 2019, and it says V.R. Still tells the brooch story. She says right off the dresser. Ask Mom what room she was in. 2 weeks later I asked my mother gently over the phone if she remembered where she'd been working that morning. She said, "The upstairs hall. And the cedar closet." She had me clear out the cedar closet under the attic stairs because she said it smelled. I said, "The dresser's in the bedroom, right?" My mother said, "Marin, why are we talking about this?" I said, "No reason. It came up." And she said, and I can hear her saying it, "Baby, let it be. Some people need somebody to have taken something from them." I said, "Okay." I did not let it be. But I did let it wait. Those are different things, and the difference between them is the whole story. Adam's father died in March of 2018, a year and a half before I met his son. Heart attack in the office of Rhodes Millwork on a Saturday morning, alone at 66, surrounded by 40 years of invoices. Adam found out from a sheriff's deputy at 11:40 at night. I never met Warren Rhodes. Everything I know about him I know from paper and from the way 3 people talked about him. Adam said his father was kind and tired. Corinne said her father was a genius with wood and a disaster with numbers. Vivian said her husband was a builder. In the way you'd say a saint was a saint, And she said it constantly, and she never once in 6 years said anything about him that was specific. The business closed 9 months after he died. Adam and Corinne told me it was sold. That's the word they both used, and I believe they both believed it. Later I'd learned there was no sale. There was an auction of equipment in November 2018 that brought in $106,000, and there was a dissolution filing, and there was a list of creditors. But at the time in 2019 and 2020, the story in that family was simple and clean. Warren built something, Warren died, the business was sold, and Vivian was a widow in a big house with her husband's staircase in the front hall. Adam proposed in September 2020, on the back steps of Braxton Middle School after the last day of summer program, with a ring that cost him $1,100 and took him 7 months to pay off. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I have never regretted a single day of choosing him, and I want that stated plainly, because a lot of this story is about his mother and almost none of it is about him. The engagement is when the temperature changed. The first thing that happened is that Vivian called me. Not Adam. Me. Alone. She had never once called me before. She said, "Marin, I'd love for us to have lunch. Just us girls." We met at a restaurant near South Park, the kind with cloth napkins at lunch. She ordered a salad and moved it around. She talked about the flowers for 20 minutes and then she put her fork down and said, "I want to say something and I want you to hear it in the spirit it's intended." Nobody has ever said that sentence and meant something kind. She said, "You and Adam come from very different circumstances. That's nothing to be ashamed of. But circumstances are real, and I've seen what happens when they're ignored. I'd feel so much better, and I think you would too, if the two of you signed a prenuptial agreement." I said, "Okay." She blinked. She had a whole second act prepared and I'd taken the stage out from under her. She recovered and said, "I've spoken to Curtis Alderman about it. He's handled our family's affairs for 30 years. He can draft something very straightforward. It's really just to protect the house." The house. 9 months into the engagement, and the house had come up in the first 4 minutes. I said, "Protect it from what?" And Vivian smiled and said, "From complication. I signed a prenup, by the way. I want you to sit with that." I signed it in November 2020, 6 weeks before the wedding, in the office of a lawyer named Curtis Alderman on the 11th floor of a building on Tryon Street. And I read it, which nobody expected me to do, and it took me 40 minutes because I read the definitions section twice. The agreement said that any real property acquired by either party prior to the marriage, or by inheritance during the marriage, remains separate property. Any real property acquired prior to the marriage remains separate property. I signed my name, Marin Elizabeth Cole. Vivian was so pleased she sent me flowers. She had just made me sign a document, drafted by her own attorney, that protected 9 properties she didn't know existed. And it protected in advance a 10th one that didn't exist yet. I told you paper doesn't lie. It also doesn't take sides. We married on January 9, 2021, at a small chapel off Queens Road, 41 guests, a lunch reception at a restaurant with exposed brick. My mother wore a navy dress she bought at a consignment store in Spartanburg and had altered, and she cried in a way that made the photographer stop and lower the camera out of respect. 3 things happened at my wedding that I put in the notes app that night. The first, Vivian introduced my mother to a friend as Adam's wife's mother. Not by name. My mother had been standing right there and had said, "June Cole, so nice to meet you," 30 seconds earlier. They did not recognize each other. I watched for it. I watched Vivian's face the whole time. 16 years, 100 pounds of grief between them, and Vivian Rhodes looked at June Cole with the exact polite blankness of a woman meeting a stranger. That's when I understood the size of it. She hadn't forgotten my mother's face because she was cruel. She'd never looked at it in the first place. The second thing, the family portrait. The photographer arranged the roadside on the chapel steps and Vivian moved people around like furniture, and when he said, "And the bride's family," my mother stepped up and Vivian said brightly, "Oh, this one's just the Rhodeses, dear." My mother stepped back down. She stood beside me for the next 4 minutes and she squeezed my hand once hard, which was her entire vocabulary for that moment. I said nothing. I didn't make a scene at my own wedding. I want to be honest that this wasn't strength, it was arithmetic. A scene would have cost my mother more than the insult did. The third thing happened at the end of the night. Vivian hugged me for the first time. An actual hug. And into my ear, warm as anything, she said, "You've done very well for yourself, Marin. Not I'm so happy for you." Not welcome to the family. You've done very well for yourself. I wrote all 3 down in the car. And then I put the phone away and I put my head on my husband's shoulder and I let it go for 8 months. I really did let it go. That's the part people don't believe. The first year of marriage is when I started seeing the house instead of looking at it. That's an occupational thing. I've walked through a few hundred properties and you stop seeing rooms and start seeing decisions. And 41 Elmsworth Court in 2021 was a house full of decisions that didn't match each other. The china was Wedgwood and the dishwasher didn't work. It hadn't worked since before I met them. Vivian washed everything by hand and told people she preferred it. The washer was original to a 2003 remodel and made a noise like a dropped wrench. The thermostat was set to 62 degrees in January. 62. She kept a blanket over her legs in the den and called it sensible. The front of the house was immaculate. Boxwoods trimmed, porch swept, brass polished, mulch replaced every March. The back, where nobody from the street can see, had a section of gutter that had come loose from the fascia and was tied up with wire. I noticed it at Easter 2021 and I asked Adam about it and he said, I'll get up there sometime. Everything visible was maintained. Everything invisible was failing. I know that house. I know 100 houses exactly like it. That is not what a paid-off home looks like. That's what triage looks like. And then there was the mail. In April 2021, 3 months after the wedding, I came in through the front door with a casserole dish and Vivian was standing at the hall table with the mail in her hands, and there was a green and white slip on top of the stack. If you've ever gotten one, you know it on sight. A certified mail notice. The kind where somebody needs a signature. She saw me see it, and Vivian Rhodes, who was at that moment mid-sentence about Corinne's boys' school, put the slip under the rest of the stack with her thumb in one motion, without breaking eye contact or dropping a syllable. It was the smoothest thing I have ever watched a person do. I said hello and took the casserole to the kitchen. I want to be honest, I did not know what it was. Certified mail is 100 boring things. Jury summons, IRS notice, an insurance thing, a lawyer sending a copy of a deceased husband's estate document 2 years late. But I had 8 years of records work in my hands by then, and I know what it means when a person hides one piece of paper out of a stack of 11. I wrote it down. April 11, 2021. Certified slip in the hall mail. She hid it. Green card, not a package. I did not go looking. That's the part people don't believe. And it's the part one most want on the record. I had access to every public database in Mecklenburg County from my desk. I could have pulled that property's chain of title on a coffee break any day for 2.5 years, from the moment Adam said the words Elmsworth Court in a diner in 2019. I never did. Because looking would have made me exactly the woman she'd already decided I was, and I knew it, and I had decided very early that I was going to be so clean in that family that if it ever came apart, nobody could say I'd gone digging. So I noticed the gutter and the thermostat and the green slip and I filed them and I let them sit there like 3 loose screws in a drawer. There were other things that spring. She stopped going to the beach. The Rhodeses had rented the same house at Ocean Isle every June since 1989. Adam talked about it constantly. It was the one warm family story he had. In 2021, Vivian said she was not up for it this year, and then said the same thing in 2022, and by 2023 nobody brought it up anymore. She stopped replacing things. Corinne noticed this one out loud at a lunch. "Mom, that toaster is older than my children." And Vivian said something tart about how they don't make them like that, and everyone laughed, and I sat there thinking about a woman who spent $11 a week on fresh pears for a bowl nobody ate from because the bowl is visible from the front hall. And there was one thing that only I would have caught. In May 2021, she made an offhand remark about her property taxes. She said the county had gotten ridiculous. And then she said the number. She said it was over $8,000 a year. It wasn't. I knew what that parcel's assessed value was because I know how to look at a tax card, and the annual bill on that house in 2021 was $5,100. Now, people misquote their taxes all the time, but they misquote them low out of vanity or memory. Nobody inflates their own tax bill by $3,000 at a lunch table, unless the number in their head isn't the tax bill. Unless the number in their head is the total of everything they're paying out on that house every year, and they've stopped being able to tell the pieces apart. I remember driving home from that lunch and saying to Adam casually, "Does your mom ever talk to you about her finances?" And Adam said, "God, no. Nobody's ever talked to me about money in my life." And then he said something that I think about constantly, and that I think explains the entire Rhodes family in 11 words. He said, "Growing up I thought we were rich. I found out in college we weren't. Nobody ever told me. I just did the math one day. I asked him how old he was. He said 20. 20 years old, sitting in a dorm at Appalachian State, doing arithmetic about his own childhood. That's the house I married into. A place where nobody lies to you exactly, and nobody tells you anything, and you're expected to work it out privately and never mention that you did." So by August 2021 I had a mental file with 4 things in it: a wired-up gutter, a thermostat at 62, a green certified slip that got palmed, and a woman quoting a tax number $3,000 too high for loose screws. No engine. And then a list crossed my desk on a Thursday afternoon, and every one of them snapped into place at the same time. On August 26, 2021, I was at my desk at Halloran on a Thursday afternoon, running a routine search, and I did the thing I did every Thursday afternoon, which was skim the county's foreclosure postings. Understand, this isn't detective work. It's public. Notices of default and upcoming trustee sales are published. The address, the parties, the amount, the sale date. Anyone can look. Almost nobody does. I was scrolling with my coffee going cold, and I stopped on a line about a third of the way down. 41 Elmsworth Court, Charlotte, North Carolina, 28211. I read it 4 times before it went in. I don't remember standing up. Ruth told me later that I stood up. I remember pulling the file, the actual recorded documents, the deed of trust, the substitution of trustee, the notice of hearing, and I remember the fluorescent light in that filing room and the specific dry smell of the copier. Here's what the paper said. On June 14, 2016, Warren Everett Rhodes and Vivian N. Rhodes, husband and wife, executed a deed of trust against 41 Elmsworth Court in favor of Kestrel Capital Partners, LLC, in the principal amount of $214,000. Interest rate 13.9%. Term, 36 months balloon. That is not a mortgage. That's a hard money loan. That's what people take when a bank has already said no. Rhodes Millwork was drowning in 2016 and Warren Rhodes put his house up to keep 30 people employed for another year. The balloon came due in June 2019. Warren had been dead 15 months. Nobody paid it. Kestrel had been sitting on it, accruing interest and fees, doing what those lenders do, which is wait. By August 2021, the payoff was $268,409. The sale was set for October 14, 2021 at 10 a.m. on the courthouse steps on East 4th Street, and there were 2 signatures on that 2016 deed of trust. 2. Warren's and hers. Notarized. Vivian and Rhodes in a looping, confident hand on a document that says in plain English on the second page, in a paragraph she initialed, that failure to repay permit sale of the property. She signed it. She sat at a closing table and signed it. I sat in that filing room with the copies in my lap, and I want to describe what I felt, because it wasn't triumph. I've had people assume it was. It wasn't. It was vertigo. Because the story I'd been fed for 2 years, the story the whole family had been fed, was that Vivian Rhodes was a widow living securely in a paid-off house, the last dignified asset of a proud family, the thing that would one day pass to Adam and Corinne. She said it constantly. This house has been in the Rhodes family since 1968. It'll go to my children. And the paper said the house had 8 weeks left. Now I had to make a decision, and I want to walk you through it honestly because I've had 4 years to be honest with myself about it. Option 1, tell Adam. I thought about this the longest. He was my husband. He deserved to know. But think about what telling him meant. It meant Adam walks into that house and says, "Mom, I know about Kestrel." And Vivian, whose entire personality is a wall built around the sentence "we don't discuss money at this table," would have to admit out loud to her son that she had known for 2 years and told no one. And then what? Adam was a middle school orchestra teacher with $41,000 in his retirement account and $9,000 in savings. Corinne and Dale had 2 kids in private school and a boat. Neither of them had $268,000. Neither of them could get it in 8 weeks. Telling Adam wouldn't save the house. It would just make him watch it go, and make him carry his mother's shame for her. Option 2, tell Vivian. I actually laughed out loud in the filing room when I got to this one. Picture it. Picture me, the girl from Gaffney with the unusual name who sells houses, walking into that dining room and saying, "Vivian, I've been reading the county records and I need to talk to you about your deed of trust." She would not have heard help. She would have heard an accusation from the one person in the world she'd already decided was after her money. She would have called Curtis Alderman. She would have told Adam I'd been looking into the family. And the house would still have sold on October 14th. Option 3. I sat there and I thought about a 12-year-old in a Buick under a water oak, and about the words right off the dresser, and about a woman blotting milk off a table saying you learn. And I want to tell you the truth about my motive, all of it, because if I clean it up this whole story is worthless. Part of me wanted to own that house because of what she did to my mother. That part existed. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. It wasn't the biggest part, but it was in the room. The bigger part, the one that actually moved my hands, was this: my husband's grandfather built that staircase. Adam touched the newel post every single time he walked past it and didn't know he was doing it. And in 8 weeks a company from Raleigh was going to buy it for the land value, gut the interior, and sell it to a developer who'd put the millwork in a dumpster. I had, at that time, $410,000 in a business account and a line of credit for $200 more. I could stop it. Nobody else in that family could. So on a Thursday afternoon in August 2021, in a filing room that smelled like toner, I made the decision that everything else in this story hangs on. I didn't tell anyone. Not my husband. Not my mother. Not Ruth. I opened a new file and on the tab I wrote Elmsworth and I started doing what I do for a living. The next 7 weeks were the most careful work I have ever done. First, I confirmed the debt was real and the sale would actually happen. Half of foreclosure postings get canceled. The borrower cures, or the lender agrees to a forbearance, or the family finds money. I called Kestrel Capital as a title examiner requesting a payoff quote on behalf of a prospective purchaser, which is a routine request they get 20 times a day. The man on the phone was bored. He said the file had been in default for 26 months. He said, and I wrote this down word for word, the borrower's been notified 9 times. She doesn't respond. 9 times. Certified letters. Notice of default. Notice of hearing before the clerk of Superior Court, which in North Carolina is an actual hearing with an actual date, that the homeowner is served with and can attend. Vivian Rhodes had been served. She had not appeared. I want to be careful here because this is the part where you might start feeling sorry for her. And honestly, for about 4 days I did. I thought, she's 64, she's widowed, she's frightened, she's frozen. Grief does that. People let mail pile up. That's real. Then I pulled the hearing file, and there was a continuance in it, requested by counsel. Curtis Alderman had appeared on her behalf in March 2021, and asked the clerk for more time. She had a lawyer. She had participated. She had bought herself 7 months. She knew. Which means every single time she sat at the head of that table, and said this house will go to my children, she knew. She'd been saying it in front of Adam. In front of Corinne. In front of 2 grandsons. Every holiday. For 2 years. That was the moment my sympathy resorted itself. Not into anger exactly. Into clarity. I stopped trying to protect a frightened widow and started trying to protect a building. And the 2 people in that family who actually believed what they were told. Second, I got my money in order. I moved $380,000 into a certified position and drew $150 on the line of credit, because a trustee sale in North Carolina requires a deposit on the spot, the greater of 5% or $750, and full funds fast, and because upset bids are a thing. In this state, after a foreclosure sale, there's a 10-day period where anyone can come in and raise the bid by 5%, and then another 10 days and so on until it stops. You don't win at the courthouse. You win when the clock finally runs out. Third, I got a structure. I did not bid as Marin Cole. I bid as J.C. Hollow Properties LLC, which is a name that means nothing to anyone on earth except me and a woman at a garden center in Gaffney. I hired a lawyer of my own, not Curtis Alderman obviously, a woman named Priya Raghavan who does asset work, and asked me exactly 2 questions, both of them good ones. She asked if I was buying it to live in. I said no. She asked if I was buying it to sell. I said no. She said, then what are you buying it for? And I said, to stop it from being sold. She looked at me for a second and then she said, all right, and never asked again, which is why I still use her. October 14th, 2021. The steps outside the courthouse on East 4th Street. It rained that morning and stopped by 9. There were 4 of us there, me, a man in a windbreaker with a clipboard who bids for an investor group out of Raleigh, a woman who I think was just a neighbor, and the trustee's representative, who read the notice out loud in a monotone to nobody. The opening bid was the debt, $268,409. The man in the windbreaker went to $280. I went to $295. He looked at me, took me in my off-brand raincoat and my drugstore umbrella, and he went to $305. I went to $337,500. He did the math on his phone for 11 seconds and put his hands in his pockets. The whole thing took under 4 minutes. There was no gavel. There was no drama. A woman with a folder said, "Sold to J.C. Hollow Properties," and asked me to spell it. The upset bid period ran out on November 3, 2021. Nobody raised it. The trustee's deed recorded on November 12, 2021, in Book 37041, page 588, Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds. That's it. That's the moment. Not the dinner, not the party, not the reveal. A Friday morning in November, an electronic recording stamp, and a house on Elmsworth Court that had been in the Rhodes family since 1968 became the property of a company named after my mother. I went back to work. I ate a turkey sandwich at my desk. I did not tell one living soul. Now here's where it gets complicated, and where a lot of people would have made it a different story. I owned a house with a 64-year-old woman living in it. In North Carolina, after a foreclosure, the former owner has no right to stay. There's a process. It's not fast, but it's not slow either. I could have had her out by February. I never considered it. Not for 1 second, and not because I'm a saint, because of Adam. Because putting his mother on the street would have detonated my marriage, and taught him something about me that isn't true. So I did something that Priya told me twice was legally unnecessary, and once was kind in a way that is going to cost you. I offered her a lease. The letter went out on November 19, 2021, on letterhead from a small property management firm called Ardmore Residential, which I hired specifically so that no correspondence about that house would ever have my name on it. The terms: month-to-month tenancy at $900 a month, all major repairs the owner's responsibility, tenant maintains the interior, no term limit. $900. That house rents for $3,400. I ran the comps myself. I set it at $900 because I pulled Vivian's finances the only way I honestly could. I asked Adam casually over dinner what his mother lived on because I said I worried about her. He said Social Security and a small annuity from his father. He said it came to about $2,600 a month. $900 was what she could pay without noticing she was drowning. The response came in 11 days through Ardmore, and I have it in a file. She signed the lease. She wrote one line at the bottom in pen, above her signature, and I want you to hear it because it is the single most Vivian Rhodes thing that has ever happened. I would appreciate the owner's discretion regarding my personal circumstances. She didn't ask who bought her house. She didn't ask for time. She didn't ask for help. She asked us to keep it quiet. And the first check arrived on January 3, 2022. $900. Drawn on a Wachovia-turned-Wells Fargo account she'd had since 1979. Her handwriting is beautiful, slanted, taught by nuns. And on the pay to the order of line in her own hand she wrote, J.C. Hollow Properties. She wrote my mother's initials on a check and put it in the mail. She did it again on February 3rd. And March 3rd. And April. She has done it 50 times. I need to describe what the next 4 years were actually like, because she owned the house secretly sounds glamorous and it was not. It was the strangest, most exhausting double life a person can live, and it happened almost entirely in ordinary rooms. Every Sunday lunch I sat at that table as a guest. Every second Tuesday, Ardmore emailed me a maintenance summary for a property at 41 Elmsworth Court. In March 2022 the water heater failed. Vivian called Ardmore at 6 in the morning. I approved the replacement from my phone at 6:14 a.m., lying in bed next to my husband, and it cost me $2,200. That Sunday she served pot roast and told the table that the man came out and took care of it immediately, which is how things ought to be done. In July 2022 a limb came off the water oak, the same water oak I used to park under, and cracked 2 rafters over the garage. $8,400. She told Corinne that the insurance handled it, which was not true. My policy handled it, and I paid a $2,500 deductible. In 2023 I replaced the HVAC. $11,200. She mentioned at Easter that the house was finally comfortable again, now that they've stopped cutting corners on it. Over 4 years I put $51,000 into that property and collected $45,000 in rent. I lost money on it every single year, and I want to say clearly that I knew I would. That was never the point. The house was not an investment. It was the only way I could think of to keep something standing. And here is the thing that started to work on me slowly, the way water works on stone. She got happier. Genuinely. You could see it. Once the debt was gone, once the letters stopped and the certified mail stopped and nobody was calling her, Vivian Rhodes relaxed into a version of herself that I think she'd been performing since 2016. She started hosting bridge again. She had the front porch repainted, which she paid for herself and mentioned 4 times. She got her hair set on Fridays and joined the garden club's board. She had gotten away with it, and getting away with it made her expansive, which is when the digs started to get worse, because a frightened person is careful, and a comfortable person isn't. I'm going to list some of these, and I want you to understand that individually not one of them is a story. That's the whole nature of it. Individually they're nothing. That's what makes them work. Spring 2022. I brought a lemon cake to Sunday lunch. She thanked me warmly, set it on the sideboard, and served her own dessert. The cake went home with me untouched. She did that 11 times over 4 years. I counted eventually because I got curious. Fall 2022. Adam and I bought a house, a modest 3-bedroom in Plaza Midwood in both our names, and I paid the down payment out of the business, which he knew about and was uncomfortable with, and we worked through like adults. At the first family dinner after we closed, Vivian said to the table, "Adam's finally bought a house. Well, his name's on one." Christmas 2022. I gave her a scarf. She said, "Oh, this is the exact one Patrice has." Then she gave it to Patrice. March 2023. Adam mentioned I'd been promoted to senior examiner. Vivian said, "It's wonderful how they let you move up in an office like that." Summer 2023. Corinne's older boy asked me at a cookout what my job was. I started to explain and Vivian said from 4 feet away, "Marin helps people buy houses, sweetheart. Like the ladies with the signs." August 2023. This one is different. This one I still carry. Warren Rhodes had been dead 5 years and there was no headstone on his grave. I found out by accident. Adam took me out to the cemetery on the anniversary, and we stood in front of a grave with a temporary marker on it. A metal frame with a card in it, faded, curling. 5 years. I asked him carefully why. He said, "Mom says the monument company's backed up." I said, "For 5 years." And my husband, who is the kindest man I know and who has spent his whole life not asking his mother questions, looked at that little metal frame and said quietly, "I don't think there's money for it. I think that's what it is." The stone he wanted cost $5,200. I know because I called the monument company in Matthews the following week and asked what a full granite monument runs for a double plot. I paid for it. I asked them to bill it as a prepaid account under Warren's name that had come due, and I asked them not to discuss the account with the family. The stone was set on October 2nd, 2023. Vivian called Adam that night, weeping. She told him his father had arranged it all in advance years ago, because that's the kind of man he was. Adam believed it. Corinne believed it. They both talked about it for a year. That's Dad. He thought of everything. I sat at that table 9 days later while Vivian told the story of her husband's foresight to 11 people. And I ate green beans and I did not look up. You want to know what restraint actually is? It isn't a clenched jaw. It's chewing. October 2024. The one that made my mother's face come back to me. Vivian was complaining about a neighbor's landscaper. And she said to the room, "You cannot let people like that in the house." I learned that the hard way. And Corinne, who had heard the brooch story her entire life, said, "Mom, the brooch thing was 20 years ago." And Vivian said, "Some things you don't forget." And Adam, my Adam, said mildly, "Do you even know for sure she took it?" And Vivian put her fork down and said, "Adam Warren Rhodes, that brooch was my mother's. It was in my house. She was in my house. It was gone. What else would you like me to believe?" I stood up and cleared plates. In the kitchen, over the running water, I let myself have exactly one thought all the way through, which was, you are living right now at this moment in a house you do not own because of the daughter of the woman you called a thief. And then I turned the water off and carried out the pie. That's the 4 years. That's the entire middle of my life for 4 years. A woman in her 60s telling a table she'd raised her children right while the roof over her head was replaced twice by somebody she decided was after her money. I want to be clear that I was not enjoying it. People assume there's some pleasure in holding a card like that. There isn't. It's not a card. It's a weight. It sat on my chest at 4 in the morning more times than I can count. Because here's what I hadn't figured out yet, and what I turned over every single week. How does this end? I'm 32 years old. I own a house. Somebody's mother lives in it. There is no version of the future where this stays a secret forever. Either she dies in it and Adam finds out at the worst possible moment, or the truth comes out and it detonates, or I give it back. That third one started as a stray thought in the spring of 2024. And once it was in my head, it wouldn't leave. There were 2 near misses in those 4 years, and I want to tell you about both of them because they're the reason I stopped sleeping properly. The first was in October 2022, 11 months in. My insurance carrier sent an inspector out to the property. That's routine. A landlord policy on a house built in 1961 gets a physical inspection every few years. Ardmore gave Vivian 10 days notice. And Vivian, who had never in her life met a piece of paperwork she couldn't turn into a social event, made the man coffee. I know she made him coffee because he wrote it in his notes. She also asked him who the owner was. He told her he didn't know. Which was true. Inspectors work off a work order with an entity name on it. She pushed. She asked if it was a local family or one of those funds. And the inspector, who was trying to be nice to a widow with a coffee pot, said something I will never fully forgive him for. He said, "Ma'am, it's a small outfit. Somebody who only owns a handful. Usually that's a person, not a fund." I found out because she mentioned it at Sunday lunch 4 days later. She said, "Do you know, I've been trying to find out who bought the note on this house." Note. She used the word note, which was the closest she ever came in 4 years, to admitting to her children that anything had happened at all. She said it the way you'd mention a mildly annoying billing error. And Corinne said, "Bought the what?" And Vivian said, "It's a technical thing. Your father set some things up. There's a company that handles it." And Adam said, "Do you need help with anything, Mom?" And Vivian said, "Certainly not." And then she said, to the table, to nobody in particular, "It's someone local. Someone with only a few properties. Isn't that odd?" And I said, "That's actually pretty common." And passed the green beans. That's it. That's the entire near miss. 20 seconds. She was standing on the exact spot looking down at it, and she moved on because the alternative to moving on was asking a question in a room where questions weren't allowed. I threw up in the bathroom at a gas station on the way home. Adam thought I had a stomach bug and rubbed my back at a Circle K on Independence Boulevard while I shook. The second near miss was worse because it was mine. March 2024. Ruth Halloran called me into her office and closed the door, which she did maybe 4 times a year. She said, "Maren, are you in trouble?" I said no. She said, "I've been in this business since 1987 and I have watched you approve invoices on a property in Eastover for over 2 years. And I have watched you go pale every time somebody in this office mentions Kestrel Capital. And last week you asked Deborah to run a search and then took the printout home." I sat down. And I told Ruth Halloran everything. All of it. The whole thing, start to finish, in about 25 minutes. And she didn't interrupt me once. And at the end she took her reading glasses off and let them fall on the chain. She said, "Well." Then she said, "You've done nothing wrong." Then she said, "And you have made an enormous mistake." I asked which one. And Ruth said, "The secret isn't the problem. Landlords have privacy. Entities are legal. You disclosed everything you were required to disclose, and you've been more generous than any owner I have ever seen." She tapped the desk. "The mistake is your husband." I said he'd be furious. She said, "He'll be hurt. Furious is what you get for the first hour. Hurt is what you get for the 4 years." And then she said the thing that got me through the following 2 years, and I've quoted it to 3 different friends since. She said, "Maren, you're treating this like a title defect. You think if you keep it clean long enough and pay for everything and never take a dollar out, the record will speak for you when it finally comes out. But people don't read records. They read faces. And the longer you wait, the more your face is going to look like a woman who was hiding something." I said, "I am hiding something." And Ruth said, "You're hiding a kindness. Those go bad faster than crimes." She was right, and I didn't act on it, and I'm going to be paying for that in small increments for the rest of my marriage. Because here's the cost nobody talks about with a secret like this. It wasn't the lying. I almost never had to lie outright. I told you the whole thing survived on nobody asking. It was what it did to the inside of my marriage. Adam is a kind, transparent man who tells me everything, including things I don't need to know, like the entire plot of a documentary about lock design. And starting in November 2021, there was a room in our house he wasn't allowed into. Not a metaphor, an actual room, my home office with a filing cabinet in it that had a lock, and I'd never locked anything from him before in my life. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He never asked. In the spring of 2023 we had a fight. A real one, the only bad one we've had, about money. He'd found out I paid the whole roof on our own house in cash without telling him. $12,000. He said, "You do this. You just handle things and then tell me after, like I'm one of your properties." And I stood in my own kitchen and could not defend myself because he was describing something true and he only knew about 4% of it. 3 separate times I got close to telling him. Once in the car outside his mother's, once at 2 in the morning in November 2023 when he woke up and found me sitting on the kitchen floor, and once at Sharon Memorial Cemetery standing in front of his father's new granite headstone when he said, "It means so much that Dad thought of this," and I opened my mouth and nothing came out. That's the one that still gets me. Not the dinner. Not the toast. That. Every time I stopped for the same reason, and I've had a long time to examine whether the reason was real or whether it was cowardice wearing a nice coat. The reason was this. The second Adam knew, Adam had to decide whether to tell his mother. And whichever way he decided, he'd be betraying one of the 2 women he loved, every day, at every dinner, forever. I'd have taken a weight off myself by handing him a heavier one. I still think that's true. I also think Ruth was right. Both can be true. That's the thing nobody tells you about doing the decent thing quietly. The quiet part is not free, and somebody always pays the invoice, and it's usually the person who trusts you most. I want to give you one more scene from the middle years because it's the one that finally moved me from waiting to building. June 2024. Vivian hired a housekeeper. Her name was Dolores Ibarra. She was 51, and she came Wednesdays. Vivian had gone 19 years without letting anyone in that house. 19 years since 2005. And now she had a woman scrubbing her floors again, and I got to watch how she did it. Here's how she did it. She followed her. Not obviously. She'd find something to do in whatever room Dolores was in. She'd start a task in the dining room when Dolores went to the dining room, and remember something in the hall when Dolores moved to the hall. And on the first Wednesday I happened to be there. I'd come by to drop off a dish. I watched Vivian Rhodes take a small blue and white ginger jar off the mantel in the living room and carry it into her bedroom and set it on the dresser, and come back out. She moved her valuables into a room and then stood outside that room all afternoon. At lunch that Sunday, Corinne asked how the new help was working out. And Vivian said, "She's fine. I keep an eye." And Adam said, "Mom." And Vivian said, "You keep an eye, Adam. That's not unkind, that's sensible. Ask me sometime what happens when you don't." And everybody at that table heard the brooch story without her having to tell it, because by then it had been compressed into a single sentence and a look. I went out to the porch. I stood there with my hands on the rail and I looked at the water oak, which was the only thing in that entire yard that was exactly the same as it had been in 2005. And I understood something that changed the ending of this story. Nothing was going to happen on its own. I'd been telling myself for 2.5 years, a story where time solved it, where she softened or the truth surfaced gently, or she got old enough that it stopped mattering. And what I was actually watching was a woman doing it again. A second woman 20 years later, on the same floors, being followed room to room by somebody who had built her entire self-image on the certainty that she'd been robbed once. Dolores Ibarra lasted 7 months. She quit in January 2025. She told Corinne it was the driving. I never told her anything. There was nothing to tell her. Nothing had happened to her, and nothing might ever have. But I stood on that porch in June of 2024 and I knew that the thing I had been calling patience was starting to look, from the outside and maybe from the inside too, exactly like consent. That's the summer I started thinking about the trust. And that's why, when people ask me if I planned all this, if I was a woman with a scheme running for 4 years, the answer is no. And also the answer is that a person who keeps records and waits for the right room is doing something. I won't pretend I wasn't. I was waiting for a door to open. I just didn't know she was going to open it herself at Thanksgiving with a glass of wine in her hand. In February 2025, Corinne came to my office. Not my house. My office. She'd never been there. She called at 10 in the morning and said she was in the area, which she was not, and she sat in the chair across from my desk in a firm with 4 employees and a filing room, and she looked around at it for a while. Then she said, "Can I ask you something and you not tell Adam?" I said that depended. She said, "Do you know anything about Mom's money?" I put my pen down. She said her mother had asked her for $6,000 in December, framed as a loan for a tax thing, and then asked for 4 more in January. She said Vivian had gotten strange about the mail. She said she'd gone to the house unannounced in the fall, and found her mother sitting at the dining table with a stack of envelopes she swept into a drawer. And then Corinne said, "There's something else." I looked at the county website, the tax records. My heart did something specific in my chest. She said, "It says the owner isn't Mom. It says the owner is some company. JC. Something. Hollow." I want to describe this moment with total accuracy. Everything I had built for 3.5 years was sitting on the other side of a desk in the hands of a woman who sells pharmaceuticals and had, on her own without any expertise, gone and looked at a public record that anyone on earth can look at any time for free. That's how thin it always was. That's the truth about secrets. They aren't vaults. They're the fact that nobody bothers. And I had about 2 seconds to decide who I was going to be. I said, "Corinne, have you asked your mother about it?" She said, "God no. She'd take my head off." I said, "Then here's what I know professionally. Sometimes people put property into an entity for estate planning. Sometimes it means a sale. Sometimes it means a foreclosure. The record will tell you which. But if you pull that thread, you need to be ready to know." And she looked at me for a long moment and she said, "I don't want to know." She said it out loud. She said, "If it's bad, Adam and I can't fix it anyway, and she'll never forgive me for finding out." And she stood up and put her coat on and thanked me and left, and never mentioned it again. Not once. Not to this day. That's the entire Rhodes family in one conversation. That's how a thing like this survives 4 years. But something changed in me that afternoon. I realized the truth was going to come out on somebody else's schedule if I didn't pick one. Corinne had gotten within 1 click. Any neighbor, any nosy bridge partner, any insurance agent, any title company running a search for a refinance in that zip code, 1 click. If it came out sideways, it would look like exactly the thing Vivian had been accusing me of since the day we met. Sneaking. Positioning. Taking. It would look like a woman who married a man and quietly bought the family home out from under his mother and hid it. That's not what happened. But that's what it would look like, and I've spent my career learning that what a document looks like matters as much as what it says. So in the spring of 2025, I started building the ending. I went to Priya Raghavan and I told her I wanted to transfer 41 Elmsworth Court out of JC Hollow Properties to Vivian and Rhodes as a gift, free and clear. Priya said no. Not no, you can't. No, you shouldn't. Followed by an hour of the most useful conversation I've ever had. She walked me through it. Vivian was 68, on a fixed income of about $2,600 a month. If I handed her a house worth $680,000, she would owe about $5,800 a year in property taxes and $3,100 in insurance and every repair I'd been absorbing for 4 years. She'd own an asset she couldn't afford to keep. Within 3 years she'd have a home equity line to pay the taxes and we'd be right back on the courthouse steps. Except this time it would be my fault. Priya said, "You don't want to give her a house. You want to give her the rest of her life in it." So we designed it properly, and it took 6 months and I paid her $11,000 to get it right. The structure. I would deed the property to a trust. Vivian would hold a life estate, the legal right to live there for the remainder of her life, which cannot be revoked, cannot be sold out from under her, and does not end if I die or divorce or go broke. The trust would fund taxes, insurance, and structural maintenance from a separate account. I would cede with $140,000. Upon her death, the property would pass in equal shares to Adam Rhodes and Corinne Rhodes Pratt. Not to me. Not to Adam alone. To both of her children equally. Exactly the way she'd been promising the table for years. She would get to be telling the truth. Retroactively. That was the whole design. The documents were finalized on December 29, 2025. I signed the trust instrument and the deed and left the delivery date open, because delivery is the moment a gift becomes real. I had picked the date already, February 7, 2026. Vivian's 70th birthday. I want you to hold on to that because of what happened on the 4th Thursday of November 2025, 5 weeks before those documents were signed. I had already made this decision. I want the timeline extremely clear, because there is a version of this story where a woman gets insulted at a dinner table and goes home and plots. That is not what happened, and the paperwork proves it, and the paperwork is going to matter more than anything I say. I decided to give Vivian Rhodes her house back in the spring of 2025. She called me a gold digger in November. Thanksgiving. November 27, 2025. 14 people at a table built for 12, with a card table added at the end for the grandchildren. I got there at 10 in the morning to help because I always did. I peeled potatoes at that counter for 4 years. Vivian never asked me to and never told me not to. The house looked good. I noticed that in a way nobody else in the room could. The new roof I'd paid for in 2024 was invisible and perfect. The soffits were solid. The heat came on and it was quiet, because it was an $11,000 system, not a 20-year-old one held together by a repair guy. She'd put out the good china. Orange oil on the table, the smell so thick it was almost a taste. A bowl of pears in the center. Dinner went fine for an hour and 10 minutes. It genuinely did. Dale told a long story about a fishing trip. Adam's nephew played 4 bars of a cello piece and everybody clapped. And then, over the second glass of wine, Vivian tapped her ring against her glass. She said, "While I have all of you." And she talked for a while about the family and about Warren and about how this house had held 4 generations, and everybody got quiet and warm the way you do at Thanksgiving. And then she said, "I've been talking to Curtis Alderman about getting my affairs in order. And I've made a decision. This house is going to Adam." Corinne's fork stopped. Vivian said, "Corinne, sweetheart, you and Dale have your own beautiful home. Adam is the one carrying his father's name. And I want to know before I go, that Warren staircase is going to belong to a Rhodes." And there was that little rustle around the table that happens when a family gets handed something it will be arguing about for the next decade. And I made a mistake. 1. In 4 years. And it lasted less than a second. I looked up. That's all. I didn't speak. I didn't shake my head. I lifted my eyes from my plate and I looked at my mother-in-law with what I can only assume was the expression of a woman listening to somebody promise away a building that was recorded in book 37041, page 588 under a company named after her mother. And Vivian Rhodes caught it. She's not stupid. I need to say that plainly because it would be easier if she were. She is an extremely observant woman who has spent her entire life reading rooms for threat. She saw my face change and her brain did what her brain does, which is take any new information and file it under the story she already believes. She saw a woman react to the word house. She saw greed. And her chin came up and she smiled, and I knew a full 4 seconds before it happened, that something was coming. She raised her glass. She said, "Let's all be honest for once." She said, "Adam married a girl who was very good at recognizing a family with something to lose. Some women marry for love. Some women marry for an address." And she laughed. Corinne said, "Mom." And Vivian, still smiling, still holding the glass, said the part that people leave out when they tell the story back to me. Because the gold digger line isn't actually the worst thing she said. The worst thing came 11 seconds later when Adam said, "That's enough." And she turned on him with that bright social brightness and said, "Oh, don't be dramatic. I've said it since the beginning. There's a certain kind of woman who grows up watching other people's houses and decides she wants one. Watching other people's houses. She had no idea. I've thought about it 1,000 times and I'm certain. She had no idea. She hadn't recognized my mother at my wedding. And she didn't know what she just said. It was a stock phrase. A thing she probably said about 6 different women over 40 years. But it landed in me like a stone down a well. And somewhere at the bottom of that well was a 12-year-old girl in a Buick, doing her homework, looking at a brass kick plate. The table went silent. Really silent. The kind where you can hear the refrigerator. Dale looked at his plate. Patrice, who had been invited because she had nowhere to go, looked at Vivian with genuine shock, which I noticed and which turned out to matter. Corinne's older boy, who is 13 and not stupid either, said "Whoa" under his breath. Adam stood up. He said, "We're leaving." And I said, "Sit down, honey." Everybody looked at me. I hadn't raised my voice. My hands were flat on the tablecloth on either side of my plate. And I want to tell you what was going through my head because it wasn't rage. I remember it exactly. I was thinking about the folder. I was thinking about $11,000 of legal work sitting in a drawer in my home office, dated and signed, deeding a life estate to the woman who had just called me a woman who wants other people's houses. And I was thinking, if I say one word right now, I will say all of them. So I picked up my napkin and I put it beside my plate, and I said in a completely normal voice, "Vivian, the turkey was perfect. It always is." And I smiled at her. And I sat there for another 40 minutes. I ate pie. I asked Patrice about her hip. I helped clear. I washed dishes at that sink with my sleeves pushed up. And Corinne came in and stood beside me with a towel and didn't say anything for a long time and then said, "I'm sorry." I said, "You didn't say it." And Corinne said something I've turned over ever since. She said, "No. I just never said anything either." We left at 4:15. Adam didn't speak until we were on Providence Road, and then he pulled the car over into the lot of a closed dry cleaner and put his hands over his face. He said, "Why did you let her do that?" And I said, "Because I'm not finished." He took his hands down and looked at me. He said, "Finished with what?" And that was the first time in 6 years that I lied directly to my husband's face, and I've apologized for it since, and he's forgiven me, and I still think about it. I said, "Nothing. I'm tired. Here's what I expected to happen next." Nothing. I expected the family to do what that family always did, which is let a week pass and pretend. That's not what happened. What happened was that Vivian went on offense. 9 days after Thanksgiving, Adam came home from a Saturday at his mother's and sat down at our kitchen table and couldn't look at me. He said, "She wants us to sign something." Vivian had spent 2 hours telling him that a postnuptial agreement would clarify things, that with the house coming to him, it was only sensible that it be protected. She had already asked Curtis Alderman to draft it. I asked Adam what he said. He said, "I told her no. I told her I wasn't doing that to my wife." I asked what she said to that. And my husband, 36 years old, said, "She said she'd hate for me to find out the hard way." I have never wanted to break something as badly as I did in that moment, and I finished making the salad. But that conversation gave me something I badly needed, which was a clock. Because if Curtis Alderman was drafting documents about that house, a will, a deed, a postnup that references it as marital or separate property, then Curtis Alderman was going to run a title search. He'd have to. No competent attorney in North Carolina drafts a conveyance without confirming the grantor actually owns the thing. And the second he did, a paralegal in an office on Tryon Street was going to print a page that said the owner of record was J.C. Hollow Properties, LLC, and that it took title by trustee's deed following a foreclosure sale in 2021. That's how it would come out. In a lawyer's office. Secondhand. With me nowhere in the room to explain it. I had at most a few weeks. So the timeline that had been comfortable, deliver the documents on her 70th birthday, quietly, privately, maybe just her and Adam and Corinne in the living room, that timeline was now a countdown. And there was a second question underneath it that I couldn't answer, and I lay awake with it through December. Was I still going to do it? I want to be really honest here because this is the part I'm least proud of and the part that's most true. For about 3 weeks I didn't know. Every argument I'd built for giving her the life estate still held. It was right for Adam. It was right for Corinne. It was right for the 22-year-old boy with the cello who's going to inherit a piece of that place someday. But I'd sat at that table and been called a woman who watches other people's houses in front of 14 people, by a woman living rent adjacent in a house I paid for, and part of me, a big, loud, honest part, did not want to hand her $140,000 in a trust account and a lifetime tenancy and a story where she'd been provided for by a family member. I told my mother about the dinner. Not the house. Just the dinner. I drove to Gaffney on a Sunday in December and sat in her kitchen and told her what Vivian said and I cried, which I don't do. My mother listened all the way through without a single interruption. And then she said, "Well, never argue with somebody who's enjoying it." And I said, "Mama, I'm so tired of that." And she got up and put her cup in the sink and stood there with her back to me and said, "Then don't argue with her. Answer her." I said, "What's the difference?" She said, "An argument's a thing you do with your mouth." 62 years old, working 4 days a week at a garden center, and she hands me that. I drove back to Charlotte and by the time I hit Kings Mountain I knew what I was going to do. I was going to deliver the documents, all of them, exactly as drafted. The life estate, the trust, the money, the house to both her children. and I was going to do it in that dining room at that table in front of the same people who'd heard what she said. Not to humiliate her, because there was no other room on earth where it would mean the right thing. If she'd said it in private, I'd have handed it to her in private. She chose the venue. And then in January, the house handed me something I did not plan. The last repair on my list for that property was the attic stair area. There'd been a water intrusion in 2024 around a flashing detail where a dormer met the main roof, and it had gotten into the ceiling above the cedar closet under the attic stairs. I'd repaired the roof but never the interior, because the interior work required emptying the closet, and every time Ardmore proposed a date, Vivian refused. 3 times. She did not want workmen going through her things. In January 2026 she finally agreed, because she was going to Corinne's for 6 days over New Year's, and the smell of damp had started coming through the wall. And I went myself. I've asked myself why. Ardmore had a crew. I had no business being in that house on a Tuesday morning with a key I'd never once used. I think it's because it was the last thing on the list. I think I wanted to walk through it as the owner exactly one time before I stopped being the owner. The house is very quiet when nobody's in it. I stood in the front hall and I put my hand on the newel post my husband touches without noticing. I looked at the upstairs hall where my mother was working on a June morning in 2005. The cedar closet is under the attic stairs, so it's wedge-shaped, deep at the front and low at the back, lined in old tongue-and-groove cedar that's gone gray-pink with age. It was packed. 40 years of coats. Warren's overcoats still there 8 years after. Formal things in garment bags. A wedding dress in a box. The water damage was at the low back corner, where the cedar had swollen and pulled away from the framing, leaving a gap you could get 3 fingers into. We took everything out. I hung the coats over the stair rail one at a time, and I want to be clear that I was not looking for anything. I want that on the record because of how this sounds. 21 years. It never once occurred to me that anything could still be in that house. It was a wool coat, charcoal long with a shawl collar, from a store on Providence Road that closed in 2011. It had been at the very back, behind everything, in a zippered garment bag with a dry cleaner's tag stapled to it dated April 18, 05. And when I lifted it, something in it was heavier on one side. Not in a pocket. The lining had a tear along the bottom seam. Maybe 2 inches. The kind that happens when a coat gets hung and rehung for decades. I put my hand in through the tear, into the space between the lining and the wool, down at the hem, and I brought out a garnet brooch. Small. Oval. 9 dark red stones in an old gold setting, with the pin bent slightly, which is how it had come off the lapel in the first place and worked its way down inside the coat before the coat went into a bag and into the back of a cedar closet on the 18th of April, 2005. 2 months before my mother was told not to come back. I sat down on the floor of that hallway with my back against the wall, and a brooch in my hand, and I made a sound I have never made before or since. The crew chief came up the stairs and asked if I was all right. I said yes. I said I'd found something of the owner's. I sat there for a while longer. And then I did the only thing my whole life had trained me to do. I photographed it in place with the coat, and the garment bag and the dry cleaner's tag with the date on it. I photographed the lining tear. I photographed the closet, the corner, the gap. I emailed the photos to myself, to Priya, and to Ruth Halloran with a subject line and a timestamp, because paper doesn't lie. Then I put the brooch in an envelope, and I put the envelope in the folder with the deed. February 7, 2026. Vivian Rhodes turned 70. She planned it herself, of course. 2:30 in the afternoon at the house, which she called a small thing, and which had 26 people on the list. Catered finger sandwiches from a place in Dilworth. A 3-tier cake from the bakery on Selwyn. She'd had the front porch pressure washed and the boxwoods trimmed, and she'd bought a new dress, dove gray. And she had her hair set on Friday like she had for 31 years. 26 people. The Bridge Club. 2 women from the Garden Club Board. Patrice Hume. 3 neighbors from Elmsworth Court. Corinne and Dale and the boys. Adam and me. And Curtis Alderman, 73, retired but not really, who had been the Rhodes family attorney for 30 years and had been invited as a friend. I found out he was coming 11 days before. And when Adam told me, I stood at the kitchen counter and felt the whole thing lock into place like a bolt sliding home. Because I knew what she was going to do. She'd told half the county already. She was going to stand up at her 70th birthday party, in front of 26 people who had known her for decades, and announced that she had put her affairs in order and that the Rhodes house was going to her son. It was going to be the crowning moment of a 40-year performance. And she was going to do it with her lawyer standing right there for authenticity. Here's what I did in those 11 days. I called Priya Raghavan and asked her to be available by phone from 2 to 5 on the 7th. She said, "Available how?" I said, "Available in case somebody wants to hear a lawyer say it out loud." She said, "Marin, are you okay?" I said yes. I had 2 copies made of everything plus a third set that stayed in my car. I told my husband on the Wednesday before the following sentence and nothing more. "On Saturday, something is going to come out at your mother's party. I need you to trust me for about 4 minutes, and then I will never keep anything from you again as long as I live." Adam looked at me for a long time, and then he said, "And this is why I married him. Is it going to hurt her?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Is it true?" And I said, "All of it." And he said, "Okay. That's it. That's the whole conversation." He carried that for 3 days and never asked me one more question, and I have never in my life been loved like that before or since. The last thing I did was on Friday night, February 6th at 9:30, sitting at my desk in a house in Plaza Midwood with a folder in front of me. I called my mother. I asked her carefully if she remembered the coat closet in that house. She was quiet a second and then she said, "The cedar one under the stairs." She had me take everything out of it and wipe it down with vinegar and put it all back. That was the last thing I did in that house. I said, "Mama, did you tell her that?" And my mother said, "I told her I'd been in it. That's why she was sure it was me." I closed my eyes. She said, "Marin, why are we talking about this again?" And I said, "Because I need to ask your permission for something." I told her. Not all of it. I told her I had found the brooch in a coat in that closet, and that I could prove where it had been, and that I was going to say so out loud in front of people on Saturday. My mother didn't say anything for a while, and then she said something I did not expect at all. She said, "Is she going to be embarrassed?" I said, "Yes." And my mother said, "Good. 62 years old, 21 years of being an anecdote at somebody else's dinner table. And she'd never once in her life told me she wanted anything from that woman, and it turned out she did, and it was that. Saturday, 2:30, Elmsworth Court. There were cars all the way down the block. Somebody had tied silver balloons to the mailbox. The brass kick plate on the front door was polished, the way it had been every week since 1979, and I stood in front of it for a second before I went in, the way you'd stand in front of a door you've been looking at since you were 12. I brought a gift, a leather-bound photo album, and inside the front cover I'd had it stamped in gold. Rhodes, 1968. No end date, $68. It was a real gift and I want that understood. The folder was in a plain canvas tote bag that I set down beside the coat rack in the front hall, and there it sat for the next hour and 40 minutes. Vivian was magnificent. I have to give it to her. She worked that room like a woman who'd been rehearsing for 70 years. She had a specific greeting for every single guest. She told the story about Warren and the 1974 ice storm. She told the story about the ginger jars. She stood in the front hall with her hand on the newel post and told 2 neighbors that her husband's father made it by hand, and that a builder had once offered her money for the staircase alone. She was, and I mean this without any irony, the happiest I had ever seen her. The antagonist is always most comfortable right before, and I knew that going in, and I still wasn't ready for how much it would cost me to watch. She was kind to me that day. That's the part nobody believes. She took the album out of the bag and looked at the gold stamping and said, "Oh, Marin, this is thoughtful." And she meant it. And she squeezed my arm. Because that's how it works. It was Thanksgiving. It was 10 weeks ago. She'd had a glass of wine and made a joke and I hadn't made a scene, and therefore it hadn't happened. At 4:10, Corinne clinked a glass, and everybody moved into the dining room and around the edges of it, and Vivian stood at the head of the table where she'd stood in November, under the light, with the ginger jars behind her and a bowl of pears on the table. She thanked everyone. She talked about her mother and about Warren and about being 70, and she was funny about it and people laughed. And then she said, "There's something I want to say while everyone I love is standing in this room." And she looked over at Curtis Alderman and said, "Curtis, don't you dare bill me for this." Everybody laughed. And she said, "This house has been the Rhodes family home for 58 years. My husband's father built that staircase with his own hands. Warren carried me over that threshold in 1972. Somebody said, "Ah." And she said, "I've settled my affairs. And when I'm gone, this house, the Rhodes house, goes to my son, to Adam. So that Warren's name stays on this address." And she raised her glass and 26 people raised theirs, and there was that warm, wet, applause-adjacent sound that families make. And Adam did not raise his glass. He stood beside me with his arms at his sides. And I felt something enormously calm come over me, the way it does at the end of a very long piece of work. I set my glass down on the sideboard, and I picked up the tote bag from beside the coat rack and I said, "Vivian, before everyone sits down, may I say something?" Vivian smiled at me. She actually smiled. She thought I was going to toast her. She said, "Of course, dear." 26 people turned around. I want to describe what I did with my voice, because it's the only weapon I've ever needed. I did not get loud. I got quiet and slow and pleasant, and when you do that in a room, people lean in and stop breathing. I said, "Happy birthday, Vivian. This is a beautiful party." She inclined her head. I said, "Curtis, can I ask you a professional question in front of everybody? I promise it's a friendly one." Curtis Alderman, holding a plastic cup of white wine, said, "Well, that's never good." And a few people laughed. I said, "When a client asks you to prepare a will that devises a specific piece of real property, do you run a title search on that property first?" The room laughed a little because it sounded like small talk between two people who work with paperwork. Curtis said, "Always. You have to know what you're conveying." I said, "Did you run one on this house?" And I watched a 73-year-old man's face change. That's the moment the party ended and nobody but 4 people in the room knew it yet. He said, "Marin." I said, "When?" He looked at Vivian. He looked at his cup. And then, because he is fundamentally a decent old lawyer who has spent 50 years unable to lie about a document, he said, "January 12th. I said, "And what did it show?" Vivian said sharply, "Curtis." And that right there was the sound of it. Everybody in that room heard the pitch of her voice change, and 26 people who had been holding little plates of finger sandwiches understood, all at once, that something was very wrong. Curtis Alderman set his cup down on the sideboard. He said, "Vivian, I wrote you a letter on the 14th, and I called you twice." And she said, "I've been busy." I let 3 full seconds go by. Then I said to the room, "The owner of record of this property is a company called J.C. Hollow Properties, LLC. And from over by the kitchen door, Corinne said, out loud in a completely flat voice, "J.E. Hollow." Everybody looked at her. She said, "I saw that on the county website over a year ago." And then she looked at me and her eyes got very wide because Corinne Rhodes Pratt is quick, and she had told exactly one person on this earth about that. And that person was standing in her mother's dining room holding a canvas tote bag. I said, "Yes." I said, "I'm J.C. Hollow Properties." 26 people. A dining room. A bowl of pears. I have never heard a silence like that in my life. Somebody's eyes shifted in a glass and it sounded like a car crash. Vivian Rhodes did not scream. I want to be accurate about her, and she deserves this much. She did not scream and she did not cry. What happened was that the color went out of her face in a way I have only otherwise seen in a hospital. Her hand went out sideways and found the back of the dining chair, the one at the head of the table, and gripped it. Her chin came up, that habit, that reflex, 70 years old, and stayed up while everything under it fell apart. And her mouth moved twice before anything came out. What finally came out was, "That's not." And then nothing. She didn't finish it. She couldn't decide which lie to defend first. Patrice Hume said, "Vivian." And Vivian said to me, "How dare you?" I said, "Would you like me to explain it here? Or would you like everyone to leave first? It's your birthday and it's your call. I'll do either one." That was not mercy, and I won't pretend it was. She'd made her choice about venue in November. But I meant it, and if she'd said, "Everyone out," I'd have waited. And Vivian Rhodes, who has spent her entire life believing that the worst thing that can happen to a person is being seen, made the only decision she was capable of making. She said, "There's nothing to explain." So I explained it. I took the first document out of the folder and I held it up, and I did not raise my voice one time. I said, "On June 14, 2016, Warren and Vivian Rhodes signed a deed of trust against this house for $214,000 at 13.9% from a hard money lender called Kestrel Capital, To keep roads millwork open. Both signatures are notarized. It's a public record. Anyone in this room can pull it in 10 minutes. Adam made a small sound behind me. I said. The loan came due in June 2019. It wasn't paid. The lender sent 9 notices. There was a hearing before the Clerk of Superior Court in March 2021, and Curtis appeared and got a continuance, which is the only reason this house survived into that summer. Curtis quietly to the floor. That's correct, I said. The foreclosure sale was set for October 14, 2021. It was published in the paper and posted at the courthouse. I said. I found it at work on a Thursday in a list. I said. I did not tell Adam. I did not tell Corinne. I bid at the courthouse against a group from Raleigh that buys houses like this one to strip them, and I paid $337,500, and the upset bid period ran out on November 3rd, and the trustee's deed recorded on November 12, 2021. And Vivian said, and this is the one I'd been waiting 4 years for, because it was the only card she had. You bought my house out from under me. And the room turned just slightly toward her. Because that's a very good sentence. In one breath she was the victim again. I said, no ma'am. I put the trustee's deed down and I picked up the next page. I said, the house sold to somebody the second that gavel came down. The only question on the table that morning was whether it was going to be me or a man in a windbreaker. If he'd bid one more time, you would have been served an eviction notice in December of 2021. And this staircase would be in a landfill, and everyone in this room would have found out about it 4 years ago from a sign in the yard. Nobody said anything. I said. Instead, on November 19th, you received a letter from Ardmore Residential offering you a month-to-month lease at $900. Somebody by the window audibly inhaled. Because everybody in that room knew what that house was worth. Half of them lived on the street. I said, you signed it. You wrote one line on it. You asked for the owner's discretion regarding your personal circumstances. I said, and you got it. For 4 years and 2 months you got it from a person you have told this table repeatedly is after your money. I kept going because once the paper is out you don't stop halfway. I said, in March 2022 your water heater failed. $2,200. In July a limb came through the garage roof. $8,400. In 2023 I replaced the HVAC. $11,200. In 2024 I put a roof on this house. $19,600. Because the dormer flashing had failed and the ceiling over the cedar closet was rotting. I said, $51,000 over 4 years. Against $45,000 in rent. This house has never once made me a dime, and it was never supposed to. And then I said the one that made Adam sit down in a dining chair. I said, in August 2023, my husband took me out to Sharon Memorial to see his father's grave and there was a card in a metal frame on it. 5 years. And Adam told me he thought there wasn't money for a stone. And he said it in a voice I never want to hear again. I said, I called the monument company in Matthews. I paid $5,200 for the granite. I asked them to tell you it was a prepaid account of Warren's that had come due. Vivian's hand came up to her mouth, because she'd wept on the phone that night. She told her son his father thought of everything. She told this story to this room. Patrice Hume had heard it. I watched Patrice Hume's face while she remembered hearing it. I said, I'm not telling you that to hurt you. I'm telling you because in 11 weeks you'll hear it from someone else and it'll sound worse. And now Vivian was crying. Not performing. Her shoulders had come down and forward and she looked, for the first time since I'd met her, exactly 70 years old. She said, why would you do all that? And I said, because Adam touches that newel post every time he walks past it and he doesn't know he's doing it. She looked at her son. And then I opened the folder the rest of the way. I said, there's a second reason I'm here today, and I need Curtis to look at this, because nobody in this room should have to take my word for anything. And I handed Curtis Alderman a 41-page instrument, and I put a copy on the dining table in front of Vivian, on the wood on the orange oil, next to the pears. I said, that's a deed and a trust agreement prepared by Priya Raghavan at Raghavan Legal. It conveys this property into a trust. It grants Vivian and Rhodes a life estate, the legal right to live in this house for the rest of her life, which cannot be revoked, cannot be sold, and does not end if I die, divorce, or go bankrupt. Somebody said, oh my God. I said, It funds a maintenance account with $140,000 for taxes, insurance, and structural repairs, so that the house can never fail you financially again. I said. And on her death, the property passes in equal shares to Adam Rhodes and Corinne Rhodes Pratt. Not to me. My name is nowhere in the remainder. Curtis Alderman was reading fast, the way old lawyers read, thumb down the page. He got to the signature block and he stopped. And I said, "Curtis, read the execution date out loud." He looked up at me. He knew exactly why I was asking. And he said, "December 29th, 2025. I let that sit. Then I said, "Vivian, when did you call me a gold digger in front of 14 people?" She didn't answer. Corinne said from the doorway, "November 27th. I said, "I signed those papers a month after that. And I started paying for them in April 10 months ago, which Ms. Raghavan will confirm to anyone who calls her, including her invoices." I said, "You don't have to like me, but you are going to have to be accurate about me." And Vivian Rhodes sat down in the chair at the head of her own table without looking behind her to see if it was there. I should have stopped. If this were a story about being a good person, that's where it ends. She's 70, she's sitting down, the house is safe, the truth is out. But there was one more envelope in that folder, and I had driven to Gaffney to ask permission for it. I said, "There's one more thing, and this one isn't about money." I said, "Do you remember what you told everyone at this table in October 2024? About the help you had and what you learned?" She didn't move. I said, "Her name was June Cole." And I watched it. I watched 21 years arrive on a woman's face. Not recognition, she still didn't have the face. What arrived was the name and the fact that I had it. I said, "She cleaned this house on Thursdays in 2005. On June 9th of that year you told her not to come back, because a garnet brooch that belonged to your mother was missing from your dresser. You didn't call the police. You paid her for the day." I said, "She lost 4 other clients on this street within 6 weeks. You didn't do that on purpose. It just happens when a woman like you stops using somebody." I said, "She worked at a laundry on Highway 11 that fall for $9 an hour, and she didn't go to a dentist for 4 years. The room was so quiet." I said, "And for 21 years you have told the story of that woman at this table. To your children. To your grandchildren. To guests. Every time somebody spilled something. She has been the thief in your house for 2 decades, and she has never once been in a room where she could answer it." And Vivian said very faintly, That was so long ago." I said, "The last thing you had her do on her last day was empty out the cedar closet under the attic stairs and wipe it down with vinegar and put everything back. She told you she'd been in that closet. That's why you were sure." And then I took out the envelope, and I put it in her hand, and I closed her fingers around it because she wasn't doing it herself. I said, "On January 6th of this year, while you were at Corinne's, I finally repaired the ceiling over that closet, and we had to take everything out of it. In the back, in a zippered garment bag with a dry cleaner's tag dated April 18, 2005, there was a charcoal wool coat with a shawl collar. The lining is torn along the bottom hem." I said, "It had worked its way down inside the coat. The pin is bent." Vivian Rhodes opened the envelope and tipped a garnet brooch into her palm. And she made a sound. I have heard people make that sound at funerals. It is not a scream and it is not a sob. It's the noise a person makes when a load-bearing wall in their own head comes down. She said, "Oh, just that. Oh." Her sister-in-law had to take the wine out of her other hand. I said, "I photographed all of it in place before I touched it. The coat, the tag, the bag, the tear, the closet. Time-stamped and emailed that morning to my attorney and to my employer. Not because I thought you'd accuse me of planting it." I said, "Because I have spent 11 years proving what happened to things, and I was not going to let the one that mattered rest on my word." And then finally, and I had thought about this last piece for 4 years, and I had never once been able to plan the sentence, so what came out is just what came out. I said, "Vivian, do you know what J.C. Hollow Properties stands for?" She looked up at me with a brooch in her hand and her mouth open. I said, "June Cole. My mother." I said, "You have been writing her initials on a check on the 3rd of every month for 50 months. You have mailed my mother's name to a post office box 50 times, so you could keep living in this house." And I said, "She never took anything from you in her life, but she has been paying your bills for 4 years because everything I have because she cleaned other people's houses so I could go and be excellent." Nobody moved. Vivian Rhodes put both hands flat on her mother's dining table, on the wood her father-in-law built, with a garnet brooch under one palm, and she put her forehead down on her own knuckles in front of 26 people. And the first person to move in that room was Patrice Hume, who had known her for 38 years, who got her coat off the rack in the front hall, and put it on and left without saying goodbye. The party did not end. That's the strange thing about disasters in nice houses. Nobody knows how to leave. For about 90 seconds people stood there holding little plates. Then a neighbor said something about needing to move her car, and the room drained in under 6 minutes, and every single person said "Happy birthday Vivian" on the way out, because that's what you say, and each one landed like a drop dish. Corinne walked her boys out to the car and came back in alone. Dale stayed by the window with his arms crossed and didn't look at anybody for 20 minutes, and then he cleaned up. He put finger sandwiches in Tupperware for half an hour, which is the most useful thing anyone did that day. Adam sat in a dining chair with his elbows on his knees, and eventually he stood up and walked over to his mother. And I want to tell you what my husband did because I think it's the best thing anyone did in that house in 58 years. He knelt down next to her chair. He didn't yell. He didn't ask about the loan or the notices or the hearing or the 4 years. He said, "Mom, did you know? At Thanksgiving, when you stood up and promised the house to me, did you know it wasn't yours?" And Vivian Rhodes lifted her head and looked at her son, and she had a chance right there to lie one more time, and I honestly did not know which way it would go. She said, "Yes." Adam nodded slowly. He said, "Okay." And he stood up and walked out to the front porch and stayed there a long time. Corinne sat down next to her mother and said, "Why didn't you tell us?" And Vivian said the truest thing I ever heard her say, and she said it to the tablecloth, "Because then you'd have known what he did. And then you'd have known what I let him do. Warren. The loan. The signature next to his. 4 years of certified letters and a foreclosure hearing and a $900 check every month. All of it. To protect a dead man's reputation and her own part in it. That's the whole architecture. We don't discuss money at this table. That rule wasn't manners. It was a tarp thrown over a hole in the floor in 2016. And the entire family walked around the tarp for a decade because nobody wanted to be the one who lifted it. Curtis Alderman left around 6. On the way out he stopped in front of me in the hall and said, "That trust instrument is the cleanest piece of drafting I've seen in 10 years. Then he said, "I should have made her tell them in 2021. And he shook my hand with both of his, which old men do when they're apologizing for something they can't say. Now, the part everyone asks about, did I still do it? Because I had every legal right to walk out of that house that night, keep the deed, keep the $140,000, and let a 70-year-old woman who had just been publicly stripped go on paying $900 a month to a landlord she now knew was me. Or worse. Adam and I drove home in silence and sat in our kitchen until 11 at night, and here is what I decided, and I made him hear all of it before I did anything. I told him I would deliver the trust, fully, unchanged. The life estate, the money, the house to him and his sister. On one condition, and it was not negotiable, and it had nothing to do with me. I said, "She says it to June. In person. Out loud. Not a letter. Not a phone call. Not through Adam." Adam said, "She'll never do it." I said, "Then she can pay $900 a month for the rest of her life, and she can keep the roof and the heat and every single thing I've already done, and she will never hear from me again." That's not a threat. That's just where it stops. That's the version of revenge I ended up with, and I know it isn't the loud one. I've thought a lot about why I didn't take the loud one, and the honest answer is that I'd already had it. I'd had it in that dining room in front of 26 people. It lasted about 11 minutes and it was the most complete thing I have ever felt, and it was over by the time I got to the car. What I actually wanted couldn't be taken from her. It had to be given. But before any of that, I had to pay Ruth Halloran's invoice, because on the Monday after the party, Adam came home from school, put his bag down, and said the thing I'd been dreading since November 2021. He said, "I need to ask you something and I need you not to be careful with me." He said, "For years. You sat at that table for 4 years." I said yes. He said, "You watched me stand at my father's grave and be grateful to a dead man for a headstone you bought." I said yes. And he said, "Marin, I'm not angry that you bought the house. I'd have done the same thing if I'd had the money, and I didn't, and that's not your fault." His voice went, "I'm angry that you decided I couldn't handle knowing. You made a call about what I was strong enough for. My mother's been doing that to me my entire life. That is the single worst sentence anyone has ever said to me, and it was completely fair. I didn't defend it. I'd had my defenses ready for 4 years, that it would have destroyed him, that he'd have had to choose, that I was protecting him. And I heard them in my head and they sounded exactly like we don't discuss money at this table. That's the thing about that house. It's contagious. I married into a family whose founding rule was that hard information is a burden you carry alone so the people you love can stay comfortable. And I told myself I was nothing like them, and then I ran that exact operation for 50 months in a locked filing cabinet. So I said the only true thing I had. I said, "You're right. I did the Rhodes thing. I did it to a Rhodes." He sat down on the arm of the couch and put his hands on his knees. We didn't fix it that night. We fixed it over about 4 months in pieces in the car and at the kitchen table and once badly, in a parking lot outside a Harris Teeter. What we ended up with is this. Every account I have is in a shared folder now with the passwords in a place he can get to. Every property. Every LLC. The line of credit. The whole thing laid out on one page, updated quarterly whether he wants to look at it or not. And once a month on the first Sunday we sit down for 20 minutes and I tell him everything I did with money that month out loud, including the boring parts. He hated it at first. He said it felt like a performance. I said, "It is. That's the point. Your family's problem was never the debt. It was that nobody ever had to say a number out loud in that house. He's the one who suggested we keep doing it after the first year. And the last thing which he asked for and which I gave him without argument, I offered to sell the properties. All 9. I put it on the table seriously in March. I said if the money is what's between us, I will liquidate it and will live on 2 salaries and I will not miss it." And my husband looked at me like I'd lost my mind and said, "Marin, you built that with your own hands starting from a receptionist desk. Don't you dare." Then he said, "I don't want you to have less. I want to know what you have." 12 years of title work, and I've never seen a cleaner statement of the difference between resentment and a marriage. I sent it through Curtis, because that's how that family communicates, and I was done trying to change them. 9 days went by. 9. Corinne told me later what happened in those 9 days. Vivian did not leave the house. 2 women from the Garden Club board resigned from a committee she chaired, which everybody understood. The Bridge Club met at Patrice's for the first time in 11 years. She got a card from a neighbor that said, "Thinking of you," which is what people on that street send instead of asking a question. And on the 10th day, February 17th, Curtis called me and said, "She'll do it." And then he said, "Marin, she asked me to ask you what she should wear." I sat down on the stairs when I hung up, because that is the single saddest sentence I have ever been handed. 70 years old, caught in the largest lie of her life, about to go apologize to a woman she destroyed in 2005, and the only instrument she has for approaching a moment of moral consequence is, "What do I wear?" I told Curtis to tell her, something she wouldn't mind sitting in a garden center break room in, because my mother would not take a day off. I asked. She said no. February 21st, 2026. A Saturday. Gaffney, South Carolina. The garden center off Highway 11 has a break room with 2 round tables, a vending machine, a coffee maker with a burnt pot on it, and a bulletin board with the schedule and a flyer about a chili cook-off. My mother was on shift until 2. Vivian came at 1:30 with Adam driving. She wore a navy skirt and a plain cardigan and flat shoes, and no pearls, and she looked smaller than I had ever seen her look, and she carried her handbag with both hands in front of her like a schoolgirl. My mother came in with dirt on her knees, because it was a Saturday in February and everybody in South Carolina wants pansies. She washed her hands at the little sink and dried them on her jeans and sat down. And these 2 women looked at each other across a folding table for the first time in 21 years. Vivian said, "Mrs. Cole." And my mother said, "June's fine." I want to tell you, Vivian gave a beautiful speech. She didn't. She got about 6 words into something prepared and it fell apart on her. And what she actually said in pieces was this. She said she had accused June of taking her mother's brooch in June of 2005. She said she had known even then that she had no proof. She said she had told the story for 21 years to anyone who would listen. She said, "I did it because it was easier than believing I'd lost it. And because you were the only person in the house I could afford to be wrong about." That's the sentence. That's the whole thing. Right there. You were the only person in the house I could afford to be wrong about. And then she took the brooch out of her handbag and slid it across the table and said, "I want you to have it." And my mother looked at it for a second. And she pushed it back. She said, "No, ma'am. That's your mother's," she said. "I never wanted it in 2005 and I don't want it now. I wanted you to know I never touched it." And Vivian said, "What can I do?" And my mother, 62 years old, in a break room with a vending machine humming behind her, said, "You can tell the people you told." That's all she asked for. She didn't ask for money. I asked her afterward in the car why not 21 years for clients, a laundry job, 4 years without a dentist, and my mother said, "Because if she pays me, she's finished. If she has to say it out loud to everybody she said the other thing to, she's not finished for a long time. I have made a career out of documents and my mother outlawyered me in one sentence." Vivian said okay. And she did it. That's the part one did not expect. Over the following 2 months she wrote to 11 people. Neighbors on Elmsworth Court, 2 women from the Garden Club, 3 from the Bridge Club, Patrice Hume, and at the end her own grandchildren. Corinne showed me the one the boys got. It's 4 lines long and the handwriting is not steady, and it says, in part, that their grandmother accused a woman of stealing and was wrong, and that the woman's name was June Cole, and that they should know her name because she'd known theirs for 20 years. The trust was delivered on March 3, 2026. Vivian and Rhodes holds a life estate in 41 Elmsworth Court. Taxes and insurance and the roof and the heat come out of an account she can't overdraw. Nobody can put her out of that house as long as she lives, including me, including a judge, including anybody who marries anybody. And on the day she dies, it goes to Adam and Corinne in equal shares, which is exactly what she stood up and promised at Thanksgiving. Except now it's true, and it's on paper, and it's in book 37402, page 119. She never wrote a 51st check. The lease terminated. The 50th one, dated February 3, 2026, arrived at a post office box 11 days before her birthday, and I never deposited it. It's in my desk drawer. $900, beautiful slanted handwriting taught by nuns, made out to J.C. Hollow Properties. I'm going to keep it forever. It's July now. 5 months. We are not a healed family, and I want to be careful not to sell you something that isn't real. Corinne and her mother are strained. Adam talks to her every Sunday and it costs him something every time. There are 2 neighbors on that street who crossed to the other side. But there was a Sunday lunch in May. 9 of us. And Vivian cooked and served, and at the end she stood up with a glass of tea, not wine, and said thank you all for coming and sat down. That's it. That's the whole toast. 70 years old and she has finally learned to say a short one. She and my mother are not friends. They will never be friends. But in April my mother sent her a hydrangea from the garden center, because my mother is a better person than I am and always has been, and Vivian planted it by the back steps, and she sends me a photograph of it every few weeks with no message attached, which I've decided is her version of a sentence she can't say. And I want to tell you the last thing because it's the one I actually think about. At that lunch in May, Adam walked through the front hall ahead of me, and his hand came out and brushed the newel post his grandfather made, the way it has 10,000 times, without him knowing he does it. And Vivian saw me watching him do it, and she didn't say anything. She just looked at me and her chin didn't come up. That's the whole payoff. That's what 4 years and $51,000 and 11 minutes in a dining room bought me. Not an apology to me, I never got one and I've stopped waiting. What I got was the end of a lie that had been running since before I was old enough to understand it, and a woman who now knows exactly who is standing in front of her. Here's what I've learned and then I'll let you go. The people who are certain you want something from them are almost always protecting something they're afraid to look at. Vivian Rhodes called me a gold digger for 6 years because if I was after the family money, then there was family money. And if there was family money, then her husband hadn't signed away the house, and she hadn't signed it right next to him. I wasn't a threat to her wealth. I was a threat to her story. And the second thing, which my mother gave me for free when I was 11 and didn't want it, you do not have to answer people while they're enjoying it. Let them enjoy it. Write it down. Then go be excellent and keep every receipt. And when the day comes that you finally speak, don't raise your voice, just open the folder. That's my story. A garnet brooch in the lining of a coat with a dry cleaner's tag dated April 18, 2005. 50 rent checks made out to my mother's initials, one of them still in my desk drawer, never cashed, and a hand-turned newel post that my husband touches every single time he walks past it, in a house that will belong to him and his sister, In a family that finally knows my mother's name. If somebody in your life has decided who you are and never once asked, you don't owe them a speech. You owe yourself a record. Keep it. Quietly. You will know when it's time. Share this with somebody who's been called something they didn't deserve and swallowed it to keep the peace. And tell me in the comments about the moment you stayed silent, and whether you'd stay silent again. Subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.